I was 30,000 feet above the Atlantic when the man I hated most saved my life. I want you to understand that hatred first, because without it, nothing that happened on that island makes sense. Without it, you won't understand why I fought him, why I hit his chest with my fists when we were finally safe, why I cried into a stranger's shoulder at a hospital instead of his. You need to know how deep the hate went so you can understand how far it had to fall. My name is Clara Voss. For 3 years, I worked as an accounts coordinator for Rossetti Global Shipping, a company that moved cargo across oceans and, if the whispers in the break room were true, moved other things too. Things that never appeared on any manifest. Damien Rossetti was the name on the letterhead. Cold eyes, tailored suits the color of midnight, a voice that never rose because it never had to. Men who worked for him did not question him twice. I told myself I worked for a shipping company. I told myself the rumors were rumors. I told myself that until the day my mother collapsed in her kitchen with a blood vessel tearing loose in her brain, and I stood in Damien Rossetti's office begging for 1 day off and a salary advance so I could pay for the surgery that would keep her alive. There were 3 men in that office with him, men with silent faces and colder eyes than his. I remember the smell of cigar smoke and leather. I remember my voice cracking as I said the word please. Damien did not look up from the papers in his hands. Personal tragedy, he said, does not pause business. I remember the silence after that. I remember one of the men smiling, like my desperation was entertainment. I remember walking out of that office feeling smaller than I had ever felt in my life. And I remember promising myself, somewhere between the elevator and the parking garage, that I would never again let that man see me want anything. My mother lived. An anonymous donation reached the hospital before midnight, more than enough to cover the surgery and the recovery after. I never knew where it came from. I assumed a charity, a mistake, an act of God. I did not know, not for 1 full year, that it came from him. For that year, I gave Damien Rossetti flawless work, every report on time, every number correct. I gave him silence where other employees gave him fear, and I gave him nothing where he might have wanted respect. I built a wall so high around my hatred that I stopped questioning it. Hatred was simple. Hatred did not ask complicated things of me, and that is where I was. 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, on his private jet, 3 seats away from the man who had let my mother's life hang by a thread while men in expensive suits watched me break when everything went wrong. The cabin of Damien's jet was the kind of quiet that money buys. Cream leather seats stitched so precisely they looked painted on. Dark walnut paneling that gleamed under soft gold light. 2 of his men sat near the rear, silent as furniture, their eyes doing the work their mouths never did. Outside the oval windows, the ocean stretched out in a flat, endless silver, the kind of calm that makes you forget how much water is beneath you, how far down the dark actually goes. Damien sat across the aisle from me, a manila folder open in his lap, his tie loosened just enough to remind me he was still human somewhere beneath the composure. He hadn't spoken to me since the airport. I hadn't wanted him to, but something in me had been building for a year, and 30,000 feet above an ocean, with nowhere left to run, it finally broke loose. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He didn't look up. "You may. Do you ever think about that day? In your office, when I asked you for help?" His pen stopped moving. That was the only sign I had that the question landed anywhere at all. "Which day?" he said. "Would that be?" "You know which day." He closed the folder slowly, the way a man closes a door he doesn't want opened again. "I remember it. Do you ever feel guilty?" For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. His jaw tightened, and something moved behind his eyes that I had never seen there before. Something that looked absurdly like pain. "Clara." The jet lurched, not a shudder, not turbulence. A violent, metal screaming lurch that threw my body sideways against the armrest, and then the sound came, a boom that didn't belong in the sky, followed by an orange flash outside my window that turned the ocean beneath us into fire. "Right engine." The pilot's voice tore through the intercom, no longer calm, no longer trained. "We've lost the right engine. We are going down, I repeat, we are going down." Red emergency lights flooded the cabin, washing Damien's face in a color I would see in my nightmares for months afterward. Smoke poured from a vent above the cockpit door. One of the guards was thrown from his seat, hitting the overhead compartment with a sickening crack. "Impact in under a minute," the pilot screamed. "Brace, brace, brace." My hands were shaking too hard to work the buckle. I looked down at my seatbelt and realized, with a horror that swallowed every other thought in my mind, that it hadn't caught. It had never caught. I had fastened it wrong at the gate, distracted, angry, thinking only of the question I wanted to ask him. And now the plane was falling out of the sky, and my seatbelt was loose. Damien. His name came out of me like a scream, not a request. He was already moving. He tore his own belt free and crossed the tilting, shrieking cabin as debris rained down around him, as the floor bucked beneath his feet like something alive and dying. He reached me in 2 strides, dropped to his knees, and his hands found the buckle at my hip and forced it closed with a violence that would leave bruises I wouldn't notice until days later. Then he did something I will never fully explain, not even to myself. He wrapped his arms around me and turned his back to the nose of the plane, folding his body over mine like a shield, like armor, like something a man does only once in his life because he does not expect to survive to do it twice. "Hold on to me," he said, his voice low and steady in a way that made no sense given what was happening around us. "Whatever happens, hold on." I don't know why, in that moment, with the ocean rushing up to meet us, and the cabin screaming, and the smoke thick enough to choke on, the only thing I could think to say was the truth. "I hate you," I whispered against his chest. His arms tightened. "Good," he said. "Hate is strong, use it." And then the ocean hit us like the end of the world. I woke to salt and blood. The salt was in my mouth, thick and stinging, mixed with sand that had somehow found its way between my teeth. The blood was on my temple, dried into my hair in a stiff, dark crust. For a long moment I didn't move. I didn't want to. Moving meant finding out what was broken. When I finally opened my eyes, the sky above me was the soft gray gold of early morning. Gulls wheeling in slow circles, and the sound of waves crashing somewhere close enough to feel in my chest. I sat up. The jet, what remained of it, lay broken across a curve of white sand 50 yards away. Its fuselage cracked open like an egg, one wing torn off entirely and half buried in the surf. Smoke still curled from somewhere inside the wreck. Beyond the beach, a wall of green jungle rose up dense and indifferent, and beyond that nothing, no road, no lights, no sound of engines or cars or any trace of the modern world I had woken up in that morning. Just ocean, wreckage, sand, jungle. And then I remembered him. Damien. My voice broke on his name, raw and cracked. I scrambled to my feet, pain lancing up through my ankle, ignored it, and ran toward the wreckage. Damien. I found him near the tail section, pinned beneath a twisted sheet of metal that had folded in on itself during the crash, trapping his leg and part of his torso. His face was streaked with blood and ash. His eyes found mine and held them with a calm that terrified me more than panic would have. "Clara." His voice was rough, but steady. "Listen to me. I'm going to get you out. Listen." He said it sharper this time. A command, the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed even while dying. "There's fuel leaking from the wing tank. It's already burning at the other end of the wreck. It's going to reach here. You need to run." I looked past him and saw it. A thin, hungry line of fire, tracing its way along a trail of spilled fuel, moving toward us with a patience that made my stomach turn to ice. "Run, Clara." His hand closed around my wrist, and for one terrible second I understood that he meant it. That he would let himself burn if it meant I got away in time. And for one second, God forgive me, I will admit this because the story deserves the truth. For one single, unbearable second, I thought about doing exactly that. I thought about the office. I thought about personal tragedy does not pause business. I thought about a year of silent hatred, and some old, wounded part of me whispered that this would be justice. That I could walk away and let the ocean and the fire finish what his own cruelty had started long ago. I did not walk away. I grabbed a length of jagged metal rod from the sand beside the wreckage, wedged it beneath the sheet pinning his leg, and threw my entire weight against it. It didn't move. The fire was closer now, close enough that I could feel its heat crawling across my skin. "Clara, go." "Shut up," I snarled, and threw myself against the rod again. Something groaned, shifted, and the metal sheet lifted just enough. Damien dragged his leg free with a hoarse shout of pain, and I grabbed his arm, hauling him up, and we ran, stumbling, falling, crawling when we had to, away from the wreck and down the beach as the fire finally reached the fuel tank behind us. The explosion threw sand and heat and sound across the entire beach. Damien's body came down over mine again, exactly as it had on the plane, shielding me from the worst of the blast with his back, his arms locked around my head. When it was over, we lay there in the sand, both of us breathing like we'd run a marathon, both of us alive. "We're even now," I said finally, my voice shaking. He looked at me, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "Are we?" It didn't feel even. Even then, some part of me knew it wasn't. We spent the first hours combing through the wreckage for anything useful. It felt obscene, picking through the ruins of a plane that had nearly killed us. But hunger and thirst have a way of stripping obscenity down to necessity. We found 6 water bottles. half of them cracked but still holding liquid. A first aid kit, its plastic case scorched but the contents intact. 2 silver emergency blankets. A small folding knife that had belonged, I realized later, to one of the guards who had not survived the crash. A thought I pushed down hard and did not let myself examine. Coiled rope, a cracked shaving mirror, 6 packets of dried food rations from the jet's small galley, an empty metal container that had once held first-class champagne, scraps of fabric torn from seat covers and curtains, no radio, no working phone, no beacon that gave any sign of transmitting. Damien sorted through the pile with the same efficiency I'd watched him bring to boardrooms and shipping manifests. Except here it was shade, water, fire, wounds, and signal, laid out like a checklist in his mind before I'd even processed that we were staying. "We need shelter first," he said, wincing as he tested his weight on his injured leg. "Then water, then fire before dark, then a signal marker large enough to be seen from the air." "You've done this before," I said. It wasn't really a question. "I've survived things," he said simply, and did not elaborate. I resented, in that moment, how competent he was. I resented that even stripped of his suit, his guards, his empire, he still moved through crisis like a man born for it, while I stood there with a cracked head and trembling hands trying to remember which way was north. "Sit down," he said, nodding toward a fallen log near the tree line. "Your head is still bleeding. I'm fine. You're not, and if it gets infected out here, fine will stop being an option." I sat, mostly because arguing took energy I didn't have. He knelt in front of me, opened the first aid kit, and began cleaning the gash above my temple with a gentleness that felt entirely wrong coming from those hands. "This is going to sting," he warned. And it did, sharp and hot, and I hissed through my teeth. "You could warn me before doing it, not while." Would that have made it hurt less? No. But I'd have hated you slightly less for the timing. Something almost like amusement flickered at the corner of his mouth. "Your hatred appears to be very precisely calibrated." "A year of practice," I said. His hand stilled for just a moment before continuing. He didn't answer that. I noticed the silence more than I noticed the pain. When he was done, I took the kit from him and nodded at his palm, which was still bleeding steadily from a long cut he'd gotten wrenching himself free of the wreckage. "Your turn." "I'm fine." "That's my line," I said. "Give me your hand." He hesitated. Actually hesitated, the great Damien Rossetti, uncertain whether to let me touch him, and then extended his hand, palm up, like an offering he wasn't sure he trusted. There was a shard of glass embedded near the base of his thumb. I worked it free with the tweezers from the kit as carefully as I could, and he didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, though I felt the muscles in his forearm tighten under my fingers. "You don't have to be so stoic," I said. "There's no one out here to perform for." "I'm not performing. Everyone performs, especially men like you." "Men like me," he repeated quietly. "Cold men, powerful men. Men who think weakness is a currency they can't afford to spend." He was quiet for a long moment as I wrapped gauze around his palm. "Maybe," he said finally, "I simply don't know how to be anything else." I didn't have an answer for that. I told myself it didn't matter. But something in the way he said it lodged itself under my ribs and stayed there. By the time the sun began sinking into the ocean in long orange streaks, we had built a crude lean-to-shelter using fuselage panels, palm fronds, and rope, and laid out a massive signal marker on the open beach. Strips of red and silver fabric weighted down with stones, angled to catch any passing aircraft. Damien built a fire with a focus that bordered on ritual, striking sparks from a piece of flint he'd found among the wreckage debris, coaxing it patiently into flame while I watched, useless, exhausted, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. When true night fell, and the temperature dropped enough to raise gooseflesh on my arms, Damien shrugged out of his jacket, torn, blood-streaked, ruined, and held it out to me. "You're cold," he said. "So are you." "I'm fine." I almost laughed. "That's becoming your favorite lie." He didn't argue, but he also didn't take the jacket back when I hesitated. I took it finally because my pride wasn't strong enough to fight my body's shivering, and pulled it around my shoulders. It smelled like smoke and salt, and underneath that, something that was simply him, something I refused to name. "Why did you save me?" I asked, staring into the fire instead of at him. "On the plane, you could have secured yourself first." "Because you were going to die," he said, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. "Men like you always have reasons for the things they do. Even the kind ones have a price attached." His eyes found mine across the flame. "You think there was a price to saving your life? I think there's always a price with you. I learned that a year ago." Something passed over his face, quick and dark, gone before I could read it fully. Why did you scream my name? He said. When I was trapped under that wreckage, you could have run. I don't know what you're talking about. You screamed my name, Clara, before you grabbed that rod. I heard you. I was in shock. You were not in shock. You made a choice. I looked away, into the fire, because I did not have an answer that didn't terrify me. That night, lying in the shelter with the sound of the ocean endless and enormous just beyond the tree line, I stared up at the dark canopy of palm leaves and realized, with a slow and unwelcome clarity, that I no longer knew exactly how to hate him. The hatred was still there, but it had cracks in it now, hairline fractures I hadn't noticed forming, and I lay awake long after his breathing had gone slow and even, wondering what would come flooding through those cracks if they widened. I woke the second morning to an empty shelter. Panic arrived before thought did. I scrambled out onto the sand, my heart hammering, my mind already constructing the worst version of events. That he had left, that he had found some way off this island and abandoned me the way he'd abandoned every soft thing in himself for years. Damien, nothing but wind and waves, answered me. I don't know how long I stood there, my chest tight with something that felt embarrassingly close to grief, before he emerged from the tree line carrying an armful of coconuts and a length of bamboo, his shirt sleeves rolled up, sweat and dirt streaking his forearms. You're alive, I said, and hated how much relief was in my voice. Did you think I'd left? His eyes studied my face carefully. I thought. I stopped myself, but it was too late. I do not leave people behind, Clara. He said it plainly, without drama, setting the coconuts down near the fire pit. I found a freshwater trickle about 200 yards into the tree line. It's not much, but it's enough if we're careful. I don't leave people behind. The words hit somewhere I hadn't guarded, somewhere still raw from a year of believing exactly the opposite about him. That he had left me, emotionally, on the worst day of my life, standing in his office with my mother possibly dying, and his voice as flat and cold as stone. I turned away before he could see my face do something I wasn't ready to explain. We spent the day reinforcing the shelter, hauling water from the trickle in the salvaged bottles, and Damien showed me, with more patience than I expected, how to weave palm fronds into a tighter roof that would hold against wind. I cut my foot on a broken shard hidden in the sand near the water's edge, hissing in pain, and before I could even reach for the first aid kit, Damien was there, kneeling in the wet sand, tearing a strip from the hem of his ruined shirt to bind the wound. His hands were careful. Too careful. The kind of careful that made the air between us feel thinner than it should have. You're going to run out of shirt at this rate, I said, trying to fill the silence, with something other than the way my pulse had picked up. Then I'll go without one, he said, and there, for one unguarded second, something almost like a smile crossed his face, quick and real and entirely unlike the composed mask I'd known for 3 years. I stared at him, stripped of his suit, his tie, the armor of his title. Sunburned and bruised and smiling at his own joke on a stretch of forgotten sand, he looked, for the first time since I'd met him, human. Not a boss, not a name that made rooms go quiet. Just a man. It terrified me more than the crash had. The second night was colder than the first, the wind carrying real bite off the water. I noticed, as Damien portioned out our small store of food and water, that he gave me more than he took for himself. A larger share of the crackers, more of the water, always insisting he'd already had enough when I knew he hadn't. You're shivering, I said, watching him try to hide it as he added another piece of driftwood to the fire. I'm fine. You keep saying that. I'm starting to think it's the only lie you know. He didn't answer, but his jaw tightened in a way that told me I'd struck closer to the truth than he wanted to admit. I moved closer to him before I'd fully decided to, pulling his jacket from my shoulders and draping it instead over both of us, sitting close enough that our shoulders pressed together, close enough to share the warmth neither of us would ask for out loud. He went very still. You don't have to do that, he said quietly. I know. Neither of us moved apart. Tell me about that day, I said finally, staring into the fire instead of at him, because I couldn't have said it to his face. The day my mother went into surgery. Tell me what you actually remember. He was quiet for a long moment. I remember your voice shaking, he said finally. I remember thinking about her, about you, more than I let myself show. You didn't show anything. You said personal tragedy doesn't pause business in front of men I didn't know, and then you went back to your papers like I hadn't spoken at all. Yes, that's it, yes? There were things in that room I couldn't explain to you then. His voice had gone low, careful, like a man choosing each word from a minefield. Kindness with my name attached to it can become a target, Clara, for people I care about. Sometimes cruelty is the only shield I know how to build. That's not an answer. That's an excuse dressed up as philosophy. I know, he said, and the honesty in it startled me more than a denial would have. I didn't forgive him. I want to be clear about that. Not that night, not for a long time after. But something shifted in how I understood him, some tectonic plate grinding slowly beneath a year of certainty, and I hated how unsettling it was to feel my hatred begin, however slightly, to lose its shape. The storm came on the fourth day, and I have never seen a sky change so fast. Damien noticed it before I did. A strange stillness in the air, the birds going silent, a greenish tint bruising the horizon. We need to reinforce the shelter now, he said, already moving. This is going to be bad. It was worse than bad. The wind arrived first, tearing at the palm fronds we'd woven so carefully. And then the rain came sideways, cold as ice, and within 20 minutes our shelter had collapsed entirely, the frame snapping under gusts that felt strong enough to lift us off the sand. The fuselage. Damien shouted over the roar, grabbing my hand and pulling me toward the broken section of the plane's tail, the only structure solid enough to survive what was coming. We had barely reached it when a sheet of torn metal, ripped loose somewhere down the beach, came flying through the air like a blade. Damien shoved me down and to the side, taking the edge of it across his shoulder instead of me, a sound tearing out of him that I will hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. Damien, I'm fine, he gritted out, blood already soaking through his shirt, and dragged us both into the shelter of the fuselage as the storm screamed around us. We huddled together in the dark, wet metal shell, the wind howling like something alive and furious just beyond the walls, rain finding every gap and seam to pour through. The cold was vicious, deep enough to make my teeth chatter uncontrollably, and Damien's injured shoulder had left him bleeding and shaking, his skin far too warm against mine when I pressed close to him for whatever heat we could share. By the deepest part of the night, his fever had set in. Damien, stay with me, I said, pressing the back of my hand to his burning forehead. Stay awake. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, his usual iron composure dissolved into something raw and unguarded. In the fever, words came out of him that I don't think he would have ever let himself say sober and whole. Do not let them see softness, he muttered, his hand gripping mine too tightly. My father said that, every time. Do not let them see. Who said that? A boss does not beg, he continued, as if he hadn't heard me, his voice slipping into something almost like a child's cadence beneath the fever. A boss does not need. A boss does not love where enemies can count it against him. I held his hand tighter, my own voice breaking. That's not survival, Damien. That's just loneliness with better tailoring. His eyes found mine, clearer for one fragile moment. Maybe, he whispered. That's all I ever knew how to build. I stayed awake the rest of that night, pressing wet cloth to his forehead, whispering to him even when I wasn't sure he could hear me, terrified in a way that had nothing to do with the storm outside and everything to do with the man shaking apart in my arms. When the storm finally broke and dawn crept gray and exhausted over the horizon, his fever had eased, and I realized, with a kind of quiet devastation, that somewhere in that long and terrible night, I had stopped being able to see him only as the man who had hurt me. 2 days after the storm, once his fever had fully broken and the worst of the wreckage debris had been cleared, I finally asked the question that had been building in me since the crash. Tell me the truth, all of it, about that day. We sat near the ruined fuselage, the ocean flat and indifferent behind us. Damien looked at me for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he didn't deflect. There were men in that office who didn't work for me, he said quietly. Men from a rival family, there under the guise of a business meeting. One of them had already sold information about my staff to people who wanted to hurt me. Names, addresses, weaknesses. What does that have to do with my mother? If I had shown you kindness in that room, if I had let those men see that you mattered to me, your mother's name, her hospital, her surgery, all of it would have become leverage, a way to reach me through you. I believed, Clara, that the only way to keep you safe was to make sure no one in that room believed you meant anything to me at all. My chest tightened, anger and understanding warring for the same space. So you humiliated me to protect me. Yes, you broke me in front of strangers because you thought cruelty was armor. Yes, his voice didn't waver, didn't soften, didn't ask for anything from me. Just the truth, laid bare and unadorned. I chose the version of protecting you that cost you the most and cost me the least, because it was easier for me to survive your hatred than to risk what real tenderness might have cost us both. You protected me, I said slowly, the words tasting like acid, by breaking me. Yes, he said again, and did not look away. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to hit him. I wanted more than anything, some part of me still furious and raw, to make him feel even a fraction of what that year had cost me. But I didn't do any of those things. I just sat there in the sand, staring at the ocean, letting the truth settle over me like the tide, slow, inevitable, and impossible to push back out. "I'm not ready to forgive you," I said finally. "I'm not asking you to," he answered. "I'm only asking you to know the truth. What you do with it is yours." 2 days later, we decided to climb the rocky rise at the northern end of the island, hoping the higher ground would give any passing search plane a better chance of spotting a stronger signal. We carried what we could: mirror shards, dark fabric, a bundle of rubber, and leaves for smoke, up a narrow, crumbling trail that clung to the cliffside like an afterthought. I was ahead of him when my foot slipped on a loose shelf of rock, my body pitching sideways toward the drop below, my scream tearing out of me before I even registered the fall. Damien's hand closed around my wrist with a violence I felt in my bones, his injured shoulder screaming audibly as he wrenched me back from the edge, hauling me against his chest. "I've got you," he gasped, his face white with pain. "I've got you." For one terrible moment, we both thought that was the end of it. And then his own foot slid on the same loosed shelf, and he went over the edge, his hand still locked around my wrist, his weight suddenly dragging both of us toward the drop. "Let go of me," he shouted, his voice sharp with command even as he dangled half over the cliff. "Clara, release my hand, you'll go down with me." "No, that's an order." "Stop ordering me to survive without you," I screamed, digging my heels into the rock, wrapping both hands around his wrist, my muscles screaming, my mind refusing to even consider letting go. "I am not doing this again. I am not standing back and watching you fall while I do nothing. Not again." Somehow, I still don't fully understand how, adrenaline and terror and sheer stubbornness braided together, I dragged him back over the edge, both of us collapsing onto the rock ledge, gasping, shaking, alive. "You could have died," he said, when he finally caught his breath, staring at me like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find. "So could you," I said. And I wasn't going to let that happen. Because the words caught in my throat, too dangerous to finish. "Because you what?" "Because I care," I said, the admission tearing out of me before I could stop it, raw and unguarded, and utterly true. "God help me, Damien, I care." Something in his face broke open, and for a moment he leaned toward me, his hand rising to my jaw, his eyes dropping to my mouth, and I felt my whole body lean toward him in answer, wanting exactly what he was about to give me. But I stepped back. "I can't," I whispered. "Not yet. Not until I understand all of this. You, us, everything. Because wanting you before I understand you feels like another crash, and I don't think I can survive falling twice." He didn't push. He didn't argue, didn't try to convince me, didn't reach for me again. He simply nodded, his hand falling back to his side, respect settling into his expression where want had been a moment before. "Then I'll wait," he said, "however long that takes." We heard the plane before we saw it, a distant drone cutting through the wind, growing steadily louder. "There," I pointed, my heart slamming against my ribs as a small aircraft cut across the pale sky above the water. "Damien, there." We grabbed the mirror shards, angling them desperately toward the sun, screaming and waving our arms, throwing every scrap of fabric we had into the wind. For one agonizing minute, hope surged so violently in my chest it hurt. The plane didn't turn. It continued on its distant path and disappeared over the horizon, indifferent to our screaming, indifferent to the small, desperate flashes of mirrored light we'd thrown at the sky. I sank to my knees in the sand, the hope collapsing out of me all at once, leaving something hollow and exhausted in its place. Damien was quiet beside me, his own exhaustion finally visible, his fever-weakened body swaying slightly as he lowered himself down next to me. "I'm tired, Clara," he admitted, and it was the first time in the entire ordeal that I had heard him say it plainly, without pretense, without armor. "I don't know how much longer I can keep building fires and climbing cliffs and pretending I'm not still shaking from that fever." "Then rest," I said. "Let me carry something for once." While he slept that afternoon, exhausted past the point of arguing, I gathered damp leaves and scraps of blackened rubber from the wreckage and built the smoke signal myself, exactly as he had taught me over the past days. The layering, the airflow, the patience required to coax thick black smoke instead of thin gray wisps that would vanish before anyone could see them. When he woke and found the fire built, the smoke rising in a steady black column against the sky, something shifted in his expression. Surprise, and beneath it, something that looked remarkably like pride. "You listened," he said quietly. "I told you, I'm not as helpless as you seem to think." I never thought you were helpless, Clara, he said. I think you might be the strongest person I've ever met. We saw the boat 2 days after that, a small fishing vessel, far out on the horizon, moving on a path that would take it nowhere near us unless we gave it a reason to turn. Now, Damien said, already moving toward the fire we kept burning at all times. Light it now. We fed the flames with everything we had left. The rubber, the driftwood soaked in what remained of the jet fuel we'd carefully siphoned and stored, the damp leaves that thickened the smoke into a black column visible for miles. I stood at the water's edge, screaming and waving the mirror at the sun, my voice raw, my arms burning with exhaustion. The boat's path shifted. They're turning! My voice cracked with disbelief. Damien, they're turning! We watched, breathless, as the small vessel altered course, moving steadily toward the smoke, toward us, toward the first real proof in 8 days that the world outside this island still existed. When the rescuers finally waded onto the beach, sunburned fishermen who would later tell reporters they'd seen the smoke from nearly 10 miles out. One of them reached for me first, ready to help me toward the boat. I grabbed Damien's wrist instead. Together, I said. Go, Clara, Damien said, his voice hoarse, his legs barely steady beneath him. You've earned it. Go. No. I held his wrist tighter, my eyes burning with more than salt water. We leave this island the way we survived it. Together. The fisherman exchanged a glance and then simply nodded, helping us both toward the boat, and we walked into the surf hand in hand, leaving the wreckage and the ashes and 8 days of survival behind us on the sand. The hospital was loud in a way the island had never been. Fluorescent lights, beeping monitors, the clean, sharp smell of antiseptic replacing salt and smoke. Doctors moved around me with brisk efficiency, checking my vitals, stitching the gash on my head properly, murmuring about dehydration and exposure while I stared past them, disoriented by how fast the world had reassembled itself around us. Damien was taken to a separate room. Within an hour, his world had arrived to reclaim him. Guards in dark suits, lawyers with briefcases, advisors speaking in low, urgent voices, old associates I recognized from company events years ago. I watched through the gap in my door as the mask slid back over his face, piece by piece. The island man, disappearing beneath layers of power and armor I remembered too well. A tall, silver-haired man in an impeccable suit appeared in my doorway that evening, his eyes sharp and assessing. Miss Voss, he said. Vincenzo Marchetti. I've served as Damien's consigliere for 20 years. I know who you are, I said carefully. Then you'll understand why I'm here. He stepped further into the room, his expression not unkind, but firm. What happened on that island? The bond that forms between two people who survive something like that, it can feel like something profound. Fear, hunger, injury, isolation. They make survival feel indistinguishable from love. Are you telling me what I feel isn't real? I'm telling you to be careful what you build a life on. His voice softened slightly. Damien cannot afford weakness, Miss Voss. Not in his position. Not in his world. Do you think I'm his weakness? Vincenzo studied me for a long moment. No, he said finally. I think you are human, and in his world that makes you more dangerous than any enemy he has ever faced. I received my discharge papers 3 days later, a thick folder of hospital documents I skimmed through absently while waiting for a taxi. Buried in the billing section, a line item caught my eye. My current hospital stay, paid in full by something called the Rossetti Family Trust. I frowned, flipping further through the paperwork out of some instinct I didn't fully understand, and found an older document mistakenly included in the file. A linked payment record from the same trust account, the same routing number. The date stopped my heart. 1 year ago, the night of my mother's surgery. I sat there in the hospital corridor, the folder shaking in my hands, understanding crashing over me with a force greater than the plane crash itself. Damien had paid for my mother's surgery. Anonymously, the night he'd humiliated me in front of strangers. The same night. I found his room on the 3rd floor, his guards stepping into my path the moment I approached. Let her through. Damien's voice came from inside, tired but certain. I walked in, the folder clutched against my chest, my whole body trembling with something between fury and disbelief. You paid for my mother's surgery, I said, my voice breaking on the words. He didn't deny it. He didn't even hesitate. Yes. You let me hate you for an entire year, Damien. You let me believe you didn't care whether she lived or died. Why? Because I told you the truth on that island, he said quietly. There were men in that room I couldn't trust. If I had shown concern, if I had let anyone connect your mother's name to mine in a way that looked like weakness, she would have become a target the moment I walked out of that room. I chose to let you hate me because your hatred was safer than the alternative. You chose to break my heart to protect me, and you never once told me the truth. I chose badly, he said, and there was no defense in his voice, no excuse dressed up as reasoning. I understand that now. I understood it more with every day we spent on that island. But I cannot undo what I did, Clara. I can only tell you, finally, honestly, that it was never indifference. It was fear, wearing indifference like a mask. Your protection still hurt me, I said, my voice cracking. It doesn't stop hurting just because you meant well. I know, he said simply, and I am not asking you to pretend it doesn't. I stood there, tears finally breaking loose, furious and grieving and something else entirely, something that felt, terrifyingly, like love trying to survive its own wreckage. In the weeks that followed, as we both recovered, the pressure from Damien's world grew louder. Vincenzo argued, in low, urgent tones I overheard more than once, that Clara Voss needed to disappear. A protected house overseas, a quiet relocation, anything to remove the vulnerability that a public connection between us represented. I found out from one of the household staff, not from Damien himself, that he had actually begun making arrangements. A property in Portugal, new identification documents, a life stitched together far from his world and far from me. I confronted him about it the same night. You were going to send me away, I said, standing in the doorway of his study, without even discussing it with me, to keep you safe. You do not get to decide that love is safer when I am alone, I said, my voice shaking with a fury that had nothing to do with hatred anymore, and everything to do with how much I refused to be hidden again. I have spent a year of my life as your secret weakness, Damien. I nearly died on that island as your secret weakness. I am done being hidden. He looked at me for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, the same shift I'd seen begin on that beach, in that fever, on that cliff edge. Then I won't hide you, he said. There was a rival faction moving against him that month, men who saw the crash, the crisis, and the story of Clara Voss as an opportunity, a crack in Damien Rossetti's armor they intended to exploit. His advisors expected him to protect himself the old way, distance, denial, disappearance. Instead, 3 weeks after we returned from the island, Damien called a meeting of his most senior men, the advisors, the lieutenants, the old guard who had built their loyalty around fear and silence for decades. He brought me into that room himself. I felt every eye turn toward me as we entered, felt the weight of decades of tradition bristling against my presence. Damien did not flinch. He stood at the head of the table, his hand resting briefly, deliberately, at the small of my back. Clara Voss will oversee the financial audit and recovery efforts following the crash, he announced, his voice carrying the same unshakable authority I remembered from 3 years of watching him command rooms. She has full authority in this matter, answerable only to me. A murmur moved through the room, quickly silenced by the look on his face. Anyone who uses her name against me, he continued, his eyes moving slowly across every face at that table, answers to me. Anyone who disrespects her, his gaze found Vincenzo's, held it, answers to her. I watched something settle into place in that room. Not softness, not weakness, but a different kind of power. A man who had spent his entire life hiding what he valued behind cruelty was, for the first time, choosing to protect what mattered by claiming it openly instead. It wasn't a gentle transformation. He didn't become a different man. He was still the boss who commanded fear in every room he entered. But he had learned, finally, that love hidden behind cruelty eventually curdles into exactly the kind of loneliness he'd confessed to me in his fever. And he chose, in that room, to stop paying that price. Months later, once the audits were complete and the rival threats had quieted and my mother had met him properly for the first time, gripping his hand fiercely and thanking him for a debt she'd only just learned she owed, Damien took me to the coast. Not the island. A different shore entirely, one with a proper dock and a house with wide windows overlooking water that had somehow, impossibly, become beautiful to me again instead of terrifying. He placed something small and cold into my palm, a twisted, blackened piece of metal, no larger than a coin, one edge still bearing the faint outline of the Rossetti Global Shipping insignia. From the wreckage, he said. I kept it, a reminder of the fall that finally broke the lie between us. You loved me before the crash, I said quietly. It wasn't a question. I did, he admitted. I loved you badly and quietly and cruelly because it was the only way I knew how to protect something without losing it. I am still learning how to do it differently. I'm still afraid. I told him honestly, the wind pulling at my hair, the ocean stretching wide and silver in front of us. Of me? He asked. Of us, I said. Of what it means to want something this much after everything it cost to get here. He turned to face me fully, his hand rising to cup my jaw the way it had on that cliff. Except this time I did not step back. "Good," he said, echoing words I would carry with me for the rest of my life. "Fear is strong, but this time we share it." I hated Damien Rossetti when the plane began to fall. I want you to remember that, because it matters. I hated him with a year's worth of silent, careful precision, and I had every right to. But on that island, stripped of his suits, his guards, his empire, his name, I met the man underneath the boss. A man who built fire with shaking hands, who gave me the last of his food and blamed his hunger on something else, who confessed his loneliest truths only in the grip of fever, who chose eventually, over and over, to stop hiding what he valued. He did not become gentle overnight. He did not learn to love perfectly, and I do not think he ever will, but he stayed. He learned. He chose publicly, at the cost of everything his old world demanded of him, to stop hiding me in the dark corners of his fear. Sometimes love does not arrive like rescue. Sometimes it crawls out of wreckage, bleeding and stubborn, builds a fire with shaking hands, gives you its last warmth, and waits patiently, painfully, until you are finally brave enough to call it by its name. I called it by its name, and I have never once regretted it. If you were in Clara's place, could you have forgiven a man who protected you by breaking your heart? Was Clara right to choose him, knowing everything it cost her to get there? Tell me in the comments. I want to know where you land on this one. If this story moved you, like this video, subscribe for more cinematic mafia romance stories every week, and share it with someone who needs a good cry tonight.